Putin himself cannot give up, because to give up would be seen as in effect a man who is not totally in charge of everything in Russia, which he is not. And I think the situation among the Russian people would be increasingly critical.
Why do you think President Zelensky is now publicly discussing potential terms he may be prepared to accept for a negotiated peace? Because until now, Ukraine's position was always that they wanted a total victory and to push Russia back to probably the pre-2014 borders. Why do you think he's now prepared to have these conversations?
Well, I think the answer to that is fairly obvious, in that the Russians are now making considerable advances in the east, and the difficulty for them is that they don't, for the Russians, I mean, for the Ukrainians, is that they don't have enough arms. They have doubts as to the coherence of NATO in giving them more arms and the sort of scale that they need. And it's also that what he has offered or suggested is in effect a sort of temporary solution. He's been very eager to involve NATO in that. In other words, if we did arrive at a point where the current lines are stopped and he agrees that for now you can have what you've got to Putin, but on the other hand, that would be subject to change in our favor later. So it is an offer which is temporary.
Do you think it's a realistic offer? Do you think that it's something that potentially Ukraine's Western allies would be comfortable with? Because, of course, NATO membership relies on the existing NATO members, and notably the US, and we have Donald Trump returning, being willing to admit Ukraine. And do you think Russia would be comfortable in any kind of peace talks with that being the case, with Ukraine having some guarantee to join NATO?
Well, he hasn't actually asked for you in NATO to include us now, for the very cogent reason that he is not going to have Ukraine itself made permanently into a kind of how can I put it? Anyway, a shorter version of it, what it is already. He is certainly condemned by his people, and also because he believes it in himself, that Ukraine is Ukraine and should become recognized by Ukraine, by Russia, which means Russia should be defeated. He also knows perfectly well that if some so even if the Russians say, all right, we agree and we're going to do this and this is a solution to everything, that he can't possibly trust Putin to stick by that. So he is asking for NATO itself to defend a temporary situation. I think he has some reason for that, because in quite a lot of ways, the situation is not agreeable for Russia. What's happened in Syria, for example, is something which is trying for Russia, who was very proud of the fact that they had put Syria into what they regarded as a defensible and lucky and helpful ally of them. He's also got it when he's thinking about the future with Trump as the president, that Trump, has very considerable animosity towards Iran and towards what the Russians have already done in Syria. He also has a considerable contempt for what Wagner did and has been doing in Africa, which is not being particularly successful now from that point of view. So the world is actually changing considerably for Putin as well. His military tactic of having huge armies of people who are basically not trained properly, just let them assault, and how many people killed or fatally wounded or just wounded. He doesn't really care about that, but he does know that that is not going down particularly well within Russia itself, as one wouldn't be surprised to know. Plus, for Putin, he wants a solution, which might be temporary anyway, which would give the whole of the various parts of Ukraine that they not only have already seized, but which they have a geographical nature, which they claim to be part of Russia already. So I think it can't be a very stable situation for Putin anyway, and that he will almost be condemned to make it more like a total victory for him. He may also feel that NATO is not particularly keen to defend Ukraine as it should, or as they claim that it would. And I think that's perfectly reasonable too as well. So it's the context, I think, is very unstable.
And in terms of what Vladimir Putin may be prepared to accept in any kind of peace talks down the line, is it really about having something that he can sell to the Russian people and to those around him in the Kremlin as a kind of victory? So say he were allowed to keep the territory that Russia currently occupies in Ukraine, even if it came with the rest of Ukraine receiving some kind of security guarantee, do you think Vladimir Putin might be prepared to accept that? Or is he still very much of the view that they need to push further into Ukraine and he wants to continue the fighting?
If he can do that, and if he believes that he can do it, that is what he will do. And as he's made pretty obvious from the beginning, you can have a temporary ceasefire, and then he will have that as an opportunity to reinstate his army's possibilities. His aim, in effect, is to destroy Ukraine. I think that's, of course, it's terrible, but it's also very stupid, because destroying something, and even if you have your troops with flags and so on, and you get to the Kiev and show that you've really had a tremendous victory and so on, it would be a country which is literally destroyed. And you can't really run an empire with total destruction, as Syria currently witnesses.
Do you think there's any chance that Donald Trump could somehow force Vladimir Putin into making concessions that at the moment he may not be prepared to make? For instance, were he to say, look, if you won't negotiate, we will arm Ukraine to the teeth, we will increase military aid for Ukraine. could that force Vladimir Putin into seriously engaging in negotiations?
It would. I don't know what. I can't predict what the next president is going to do precisely. Although I think he would be, to a degree at least, more able to think like that than he was a couple of months ago, because the Gaza position, the condition now of Hezbollah and other armors and so on, and the position of Iran are rather agreeable to the future president's feelings. And I think that's important. I don't think that Russia is coming up particularly strongly for any of this. It does have a good relationship with China. It has a peculiar but nonetheless effective relationship with North Korea. But that too is potentially a difficulty for him, Putin, because South Korea is not going to be at all happy with what they're doing. So it's a situation which is materializing, changing. So I repeat really that I'm quite convinced that Putin himself cannot give up, because to give up would be seen as him, in effect, a man who is not totally in charge of everything in Russia, which he is not. And I think the situation among the Russian people would be increasingly critical.
And it's interesting that Mark Rutte, the NATO Secretary General, has said today that the alliance must help Ukraine get into a position of strength against Russia before any negotiations can begin. Do you agree with that?
Absolutely damn right. I'm sorry, that's not terrible words to use, of course.
But why do you think he is right to say that?
Because otherwise it's a defeat for NATO in its own way. And because NATO has become somewhat divided among some people anyway. He needs to encourage the Germans and the French and us in particular to stay strong, or become strong in some cases.
And just finally, what do you think explains this change in mood music? Why are we now having these discussions around peace negotiations, not just from Zelensky, but also from other world leaders, other allies of Ukraine? Keir Starmer gave a speech yesterday in which he talked about the potential for peace negotiations. Is that purely down to Donald Trump's victory?
Donald Trump's victory... Well, I think actually the Biden presidency has always been slightly difficult to rely on, because it's mostly about saving a possible situation for Ukraine as it now is. He's been very reluctant to allow, for example, our weapons to be used against Russia outside Ukraine, and he's not the only person to do that. The Germans have not been allowed, or they've not allowed themselves to use their long-range weapons. The various other countries in NATO, like for example Hungary, have a different attitude altogether. So it's. I remember when I was actually in Estonia when the invasion started, and everybody came around to say, "This is we must all stand together. This is really vital. But then they also said, but we don't want to upset Putin too much. So